Hi there, everybody. I am getting an alert that our webinar has now started, and we want to welcome everyone who is out there viewing to our first SAC for the People DA Candidate Forum. We're very excited to have several hundred of you joining us right now. And we're also very excited to have both candidates, Alana Mathews and Thien. Translation for today's event is available for Spanish speakers. At the bottom of your screen, you can click on the small globe icon, and there is an option for Spanish. And now our Spanish viewers will hear those instructions explained to them.
Hola y bienvenidos a nuestro primer foro de candidatos para el fiscal del condado convocado por SAC for the People. Estamos muy emocionados de dar la bienvenida a ambos candidatos, Alana Mathews y Thien. Tendremos servicios de interpretación en español durante el evento de hoy. Está disponible en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Puede hacer clic en el icono del globo pequeño y hay una opción para español.
Thank you so much. My name is Sonseeahray Tonsall. I will be your moderator and timekeeper from today. I work at Fox 40, and I'm so excited that we have been able to help with voter education. That is one of the most important things that can happen before anybody takes whatever views they have into the polling place or is marking that ballot at their kitchen table. So that's what this is all about. Voter education. Closed captioning is also available today. You can click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen to access that. We would again, everybody who is attending for taking some time out of your weekend. It's a gorgeous day for you to be inside sitting on your computer. Maybe you've taken this out to your back patio, but we appreciate you spending time with us and spending time on this topic, this race, and this forum. This is a reminder that this is a nonpartisan 501c3 event. The coalition's goal is to educate voters and provide awareness. The coalition does not endorse or oppose any particular candidate. There are just a few more logistical details before we get into the meat of this. If at any point in the program you do have a logistical question, you can type into the Q&A feature located at the bottom of your screen, and your question will be answered promptly by one of our team members. Also, we have designated a time at the end of our program for audience questions. At any point, submit a question for consideration using the same Q&A feature. Now, the program is being recorded and will be shared on the SAC for the People Facebook page. And we will start today with opening statements from both candidates. And first up today is Thien. And we're going to remind you have 3 minutes for this opening statement.
Thank you. The focus of today's forum is immigration and juvenile justice. I know about the immigrant experience, not from reading about it in a book or talking to people. I know about it because I have lived it. I was born in Vietnam, and in 1975, when the communists took over, they arrested my uncle without a judge, without a jury, without a prosecutor. They sentenced him to a re-education camp in the jungle for 7 years, where they tortured and starved him. So in 1976, my parents, my brother, and I, along with 30 other refugees, crammed onto a tiny, small fishing boat and crossed the South China Sea to escape to freedom. We ran out of gas, we ran out of food, we ran out of water. We were drifting aimlessly on the ocean, near death for several weeks, until we were rescued by a French merchant ship that took us to a refugee camp in Malaysia. I spent 6 months there before coming to freedom in this country. When we arrived in Stockton, we lived in a tiny apartment and slept on a mattress that somebody had thrown away. I learned to speak English by watching Bugs Bunny cartoons and going to ESL for 6 years. As the only candidate in this race who is currently a prosecutor, I have worked in the community, educating our Asian immigrants about hate crimes, how to prevent, defend, and seek justice in those cases. I've worked in the community educating immigrants about their rights because I see in them my parents, my uncles and aunties, and myself. In my job as a prosecutor, I have assisted victims of crimes who are immigrants. I know and understand the importance of the juvenile justice system, not only from my job as an assistant chief deputy DA, but with my work in the community. Outside of my job, I have mentored youth through programs such as Contract for Success, which was a program started by the only African-American judge on the local Court of Appeals. I've worked with the Luther Burbank Youth Academy. I've worked with Paris Dive, the founder of Impact SAC and Black Child Legacy on Student Voices program. As a prosecutor, I have tried homicide, gangs, and sex cases. I have tried nearly 100 jury trials, not court trials or traffic cases, but jury trials which require the highest level of expertise and skill. I've handled cases where children were victims of sex abuse, physical abuse, and human trafficking. I've sat and held the hand of a mother who lost her teenage son in a drive-by shooting. Nicole Clavel, whose son, JJ, was killed on his way to play football at Grant High School, was that person. That was a case I handled. And I have the empathy and I have the experience, not only in the courtroom, the executive room, but in the community to be the next district attorney of Sacramento County. Thank you.
That is your time. Ms. Mathews. I think you're going to need to unmute.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I was born and raised in one of the murder capitals of this country, Gary, Indiana, an urban steel mill town where violence and crime ran rampant throughout the entire city. My parents taught me that my only chance at a better future was to get good grades and go to college. I listened. I stayed out of trouble by staying in my books. I was an honor student, a Girl Scout, and even voted class president 3 times. In 1990, my hard work paid off when I was accepted into a prestigious college prep school in their first class. So at 16, I left home for a bright new future. Unfortunately, that bright future took a horrible turn just a few weeks after I arrived. I went for a walk in the neighborhood near campus. I remember thinking how quiet and peaceful and serene the community was, very different from the noisy, busy streets of Gary, Indiana. I remember hearing a truck pull up in the street, and then it slowed down. And then I remember hearing the young men inside call me the N-word, the B-word, and telling me to go back to Africa. I was shocked, confused. And then the truck stopped and they got out, and I was terrified for my life. So I took off running. Now, I don't remember how far they chased me. I don't even remember how I got back to campus. But I do remember bursting through the dorm doors, out of breath, shaken, in tears, and telling the administrators what had just happened to me. And their response was, well, you shouldn't have been walking alone. I learned 2 things that day. 1, I may not be safe no matter where I live. And 2, the justice system may not always be available for me. I'm running for district attorney because I believe everyone should feel safe no matter where they live. Many in our Sacramento community, including youth and immigrants, they feel our system of justice is closed off to them. There is deep distrust and growing frustration because of the mystery of how decisions are made or who actually gets justice. Sacramento County deserves a leader who is committed to opening up our system of justice to include more voices, more experiences, and more tools for safety. I am the leader who will bring greater transparency and inclusion with a 5-point plan that focuses on solutions for community-centered, survivor-centered, and justice-centered solutions. As a former prosecutor who has tried home invasion, serious and violent felonies, prison crimes, as an executive leader appointed by the governor, a mentor, and a law professor, I have the broad and diverse experience to offer new approaches to address the growing crisis of homelessness, gun violence, mental health, and substance abuse problems. I look forward to sharing more about my vision and what I will do to make Sacramento County more safe, fair, and just. Thank you.
All righty, Alana, that was your time exactly. So thank you very much. Now we will move on to our preset questions. Before we do the audience questions, there are 5 questions that we have laid out for these 2 candidates. And since with opening statements, we began with 10. Alana, we will start the preset questions with you. Number 1. Immigrants are often forced to suffer tougher consequences that flow from a criminal conviction, such as being sent to an immigrant detention center being flown back to the person's country of origin, which often contributes to family and community separation. How do you plan to ensure that immigrants are not double punished by both the criminal court system and immigration legal system?
Well, I first want to start by saying that due process is a fundamental part of our justice system. And I know that firsthand. Over the last 25 years that I've lived in this county, hosted free educational legal clinics to immigrant communities, as well as hosted community meetings and public meetings in my role as the public advisor. And I realized that access to information is the key. So in order to ensure that we have a system that both recognizes the DA's responsibility to balance the duty to protect victims, the duty to preserve the integrity of the criminal justice proceedings, and to pursue outcomes that serve the interests of justice, we should consider, and as DA, I would make sure that we follow these 5 considerations and actions. 1, I want to help prosecutors understand and consider immigration consequences for criminal offenses at every phase of a criminal justice proceeding. I also believe we ought to be open to working with defense attorneys to find immigration neutral outcomes for non-citizen defendants for offenses that have the same level of severity and exposure, which means immigrants can be held accountable for any harm that they cause without suffering that double punishment that you talked about. Number 3, I think we ought to expand alternatives to convictions and incarcerations through pre-plea diversion programs where it's appropriate. And we also should increase opportunities to erase immigration consequences of old convictions and post-conviction relief proceedings. And then lastly, I think we ought to ensure that everyone is always treated with dignity, regardless of immigration status, and making sure that we are in compliance with the California Values Act, which is SB 54, and that governs when any law enforcement agent, including the DA's office, has contact with ICE and immigration authorities.
All righty, and that is your time at 2 minutes. 10, same question. Would you like me to read it again?
Yes, please.
Immigrants are often forced to suffer tougher consequences that flow from a criminal conviction, such as being sent to an immigrant detention facility, being flown back to the person's country of origin, which often contributes to family and community separation. How do you plan to ensure that immigrants are not double punished by both the criminal court system and immigration legal system? And your time starts now.
As an immigrant myself, I very much empathize with and understand and experience the fear of law enforcement and the fear of government entities growing up. And so I want to address those 5 points that Ms. Mathews brought up. As a matter of fact, the district attorney's office actually employs many of those 5 different factors already. As an assistant chief in the district attorney's office, I oversee our post-conviction and justice and integrity training unit. And in that unit, we, for example, review cases where somebody has been convicted and is now facing deportation because of that conviction. And when that happens, we work with defense attorneys, we work with families, and we have done it. And I have personally done that, where somebody was convicted, and I'll give you an example of one, of a crime that resulted in them in being deported. That crime they suffered when they were 19 years old, nearly 20 years ago. And that particular individual now has a job, is about to own a business, has a wife who is a US citizen, kids who are US citizens. And so what we did was we actually went back, talked to the judge, and basically undid the conviction and allowed them to take accountability for their crime and plead to a crime and a conviction that did not affect their deportation status. So we already engaged in that. Our attorneys are versed in regards to immigration consequences. And we work with defense attorneys all the time, and we review cases on a continuing basis to provide relief and remedy so that somebody isn't subject to prosecution twice. So those 5 factors that my opponent talked about, we are actually doing those things already.
All righty. Moving on to our second question in 10, you will answer this first. What policies will you establish to divert low-level, nonviolent persons from conviction and deportation to treatment and rehabilitation programs that address the root causes of crime?
So one of the things that I have proposed, and in fact, I was the first candidate who ran for district attorney here in Sacramento County who proposed this idea. I want to start a restorative neighborhood court. What does that mean? Let's say you have 2 neighbors who get into an argument in a fight, and in the process, one of them beats up the other neighbor, vandalizes their vehicle, and they have no prior criminal conviction. So what we would do is, instead of taking that case and filing charges, we would divert it away to a neighborhood court where it's being run by members of the community who've gone through a training process. They would contact both sides, ask both sides if they are willing to participate in this program. And if they are, they would meet with both of them separately, devise a plan, perhaps anger management classes, an apology letter, restitution. And if the individual abide by those conditions, those charges are never filed. And in fact, the records of arrest are then sealed. So this is an opportunity for people to not get involved and not become immersed in the criminal justice system, but rather turn their lives around and provide justice. And that program is actually being used in Yolo County at this time. And the recidivism rate for those type of low-level nonviolent offenses is lower than actually going through the criminal justice system. And I've actually proposed that. I've done research on it, and we will be doing that in Sacramento. I've also worked with community-based organizations to divert people away from the school to prison pipeline, people such as, programs such as Brother to Brother, Sister to Sister, and the Wellness Foundation to really intervene and divert people away from prison. Now, we also want to make sure that public safety is not affected by this, and that the rights of victims are always heard in this process.
All righty, thank you so much. And now for your response to this question, Alana, I will read it again for you. What policies will you establish to divert low-level, nonviolent persons from conviction and deportation to treatment and rehabilitation programs that address the root causes of crime?
So my work in the California legislature and being an executive leader in an agency has informed my understanding of what policy really means. And it doesn't mean a program that you can have here and there. It is the overall structure of how you administer justice. And what I've found out, what we know recently that is going on, is that in some communities, immigrants who have mental health or other physical disabilities are being dropped off because it can be expensive to take care of them in ICE facilities. And we also know that there's deep distrust in communities. So before you can have a program, you have to establish a policy that puts in place the voices of the immigrant communities and centers them so that they can have trust to participate in whatever programs that you have. So to divert them away from deportation and treatment, I would have several diversion programs. You can have a pre-arrest program. I'd like to work with community leaders and law enforcement. So before a case is even referred to the DA's office, they have the opportunity to get connected with service providers. And we have a number of organizations that can do that, where they can get treatment for mental health services or substance abuse problems. Or we can then have a pre-charge diversion, means they may have been arrested, but then they come to the DA's office and we can make the referral. There can also be a pre-trial. So maybe they've already been charged, but we look at that. So I'm getting at, there could be different levels of pre-trial programs, but it's not a one size fits all. So you have to meet people where they are in their substance abuse or in their mental abilities, or maybe there's some other reason, maybe there's some trauma that they have suffered. So we want to be responsive to that so that whatever programs we come, we have policies in place that builds that trust and builds communication and builds access to diversion programs.
All righty, thank you very much. Now for our third question, and Alana, we will start with you on this one. At $50,000, the median bail in California is the highest in the nation. As of July 2021, nearly 4 out of 5 persons are sitting in jail pre-trial, meaning they have not been convicted of a crime as of yet. Disproportionately impact communities of color, including immigrants. What is your plan for bail reform?
Well, first, let me be clear. Any person who commits an act of violence on another person, commits a felony offense where they're threatening great bodily harm or violence, or they've committed felony sexual assault or have a recent history, which means they have a pending case or they're on a grant of parole or probation with any of these sort of very violent offenses. Basically, if there's clear and convincing evidence that they have a high risk to public safety, they should not be released, period. And it's important to make this point at the outset, because when we start talking about bail reform, there's a narrative to conflate or confuse a more thoughtful approach about who gets released with an assumption that that means everybody gets released. So when I talk about opening up the system of justice, that includes prioritizing a person's risk to public safety over their personal financial means. Our current cash bail system is fundamentally unfair because it would allow a wealthy person who poses a high risk of danger to be released while forcing someone of less means to remain in jail for a low-level offense. So we need a more equitable approach to pretrial detention decisions that should be based on a person's risk to public safety. And one of the major goals and policies that I would have would be to advocate for the expansion and permanent support of the public defender's successful pretrial services program, because that involves the type of in-depth assessment risk of harm, as well as looking at any conditions or supportive services that will help ensure individuals return back to court, such as do they need a bus pass, or do they need other transportation issues or language barriers? So that would be my plan.
All righty, thank you. And Thien, time for you to answer this question. I will read it for you again. At $50,000, the median bail in California is the highest in the nation. As of July 2021, nearly 4 out of 5 persons are sitting in jail pre-trial, meaning that they have not been convicted of any crime. High bails disproportionately impact communities of color, including immigrants. What is your plan for bail reform?
I want to start off first by saying this. I think it's fundamentally unfair for a person who is poor to be in custody pending their case, while a person who is rich or has the financial means to be out of custody. The system of bail that we have need to be based upon public safety and risk assessment. As somebody who's been a prosecutor for 20 years, as somebody who's worked in this county for 18 years, as a member of the executive team at the district attorney's office, I've had the opportunity to shape policy and to be able to implement them in practice. And I have the subject matter expertise to talk about this because I've prosecuted some of the most serious cases in the county, cases involving violence. And what we need to look at is this. We need to have a risk assessment, not a monetary assessment, but a risk assessment in regards to whether or not this person poses a threat to public safety. And I'll mention for a moment zero bail. Zero bail is something that we currently have in the county, and it's been modified. But before it was modified, what happened in zero bail was this. There were 5,000 people released on zero bail. Of those 5,000, 1,700 approximately recommitted additional offenses, including domestic violence and murder. So when we're looking at zero bail, which is now modified based upon efforts by my office, including myself, we have to have a system of bail in place that ensures public safety and risk assessment. When we're talking about releasing people, the vast majority of people under zero bail are released. And so we really need to do a risk assessment for public safety, and one that is based upon fairness to the individual so that they're not kept in custody because of economics, but fairness to victims of crimes in the public to make sure that public safety is paramount. Thank you.
All righty. I'm not sure if everybody else heard that. It just my internet connection just dropped down. I'm not sure if we need to repeat that. So anybody else managing the forum today, if you could let me know in chat or share if we need to repeat that at all for the audience, or if everybody else saw it and it's just my connection that dropped 10. Forgive us this moment. I want to make sure everybody could hear that. Okay, I'm hearing that everybody else heard him fine. I'll have to review that on the recording. We're going to move on to our fourth question. And Thien, we're going to start back with you. What will you do to revisit cases of people who are convicted before the age of 25 and are still serving long sentences? Further, how will you support their release, rehabilitation, and return to our communities?
We actually have a unit and programs that actually engage in that sort of analysis. Under Penal Code Section 1170 and other provisions that have been passed by the legislature in the last couple of years, we engage in that process. And I'll give you an example of one such case that we worked on, because I think people will point to our office and say that we don't do any of that, but we actually do. So there was a young lady by the name of Kiana. Kiana was sentenced and convicted and went to prison for robbing her John, a customer, while she was engaged in human trafficking. And she had kidnapped him and robbed him. But in the process, we discovered after she had gone to prison and been sentenced on it, that she was also a victim of human trafficking. She was also a victim of sexual abuse. And so what we did was we worked with the defense on the case to get her out of prison early and re-sentence her. We've done it on multiple cases, and we will continue to do it when it's fair and when it also ensures that public safety is not at risk. So we engage in a lot of those different policies and programs that we have in place today, and we'll continue to do so. Always making sure that we contact the victim and making sure that we listen to the voices of victims of violent crimes in particular, because public safety is important, but we need to make sure that we have rehabilitation and redemption where we're balancing the rights of victims. Thank you.
All righty. And Alana, same question for you. I will read it again. What will you do to revisit cases of people who were convicted before the age of 25 and are still serving long sentences? Further, how will you support their release, rehabilitation, and return to our communities?
So in answering that question, I think it's important to recognize two factors. One is the age of 25. And that's important because when we're talking about transforming our justice system and bringing meaningful change, we have to realize that the brain doesn't fully develop until the person is 25 years old. So I think this question is getting to the critical issue of we want to go back and look at is our sentences just and fair given the judgment and capabilities of people when they commit offenses. I think also it goes to the fact that AB 2942, that was a law passed in 2018 that gave the prosecutors the ability to go back and make recommendations to the court. And that's important because the sponsors of that bill recognize that there have been past harms based on like the war on drugs, disproportionate sentences that were impacting communities of color. So it's great to have that awareness now, but we have to realize the practices that have caused people to have unjust sentences and to be convicted and served. So what I think is important is that one, we have to again develop a policy, not have these one-offs of identifying the criteria. So we can look at things of like, are there non-violent, non-serious, non-sexual offenses, identify that criteria. Then we need to request a C-file from CDCR. We need to establish a partnership, not only by communicating with the survivors, but we need to talk to the families and community-based organizations to see if we can come up with a good reentry plan. And then lastly, we need to work with the public defender's office and social workers, maybe mental health professionals. So then you go through the procedure of actually filing the motion and attending the court hearing. But the last thing is that we need to do follow-up. If we are going to look at these resources, we shouldn't just file the motion and have the name that we can judge. We need to make sure that they're on track for success and monitor that. And then that way we can be transparent and let everybody in the community know what we've been doing. If the DA's office has already been doing it and it's been successful, then we should see more people who are only serving justice sentences. Thank you.
All righty, and that is your time right on the dot. Hard to believe it, but we are up to our fifth and last preset question. So this will serve as a reminder for everybody in the audience, all of our viewers, if you haven't already typed in your question, something that you've been brewing, into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, get those questions in, because our forum managers will be combing through and giving me some questions from you all to ask. So we just have one preset question left before we get to that part of our program. And Alana, since you answered last, you will start on this one. And this is our last preset question. If elected, how do you plan to support prevention services for justice impacted youth, aside from what's already being done to keep them in the same cycles of criminalization?
Thank you. I think it's imperative that when we open up our system of justice, that we have approaches that are just not reactive to crime, but we have prevention and intervention strategies, especially because the research shows that youth are very malleable and they have the greatest propensity and capacity to rehabilitate. So my first solution for opening up the system of justice is to have two pre-plea diversion programs for youth. One is actually a restorative justice program. I would work and have a partnership with Impact Justice. They already have a restorative justice program in California and across the country. And that's a program that not only works with youth to help them understand the harm that they have caused, but to create a plan where they can repair the harm and commit to not creating the harm again. And then I would also propose that we have a transformative youth program. And this is something I actually proposed when I was at the DA's office, and I worked on it after I had left. And that's a program where the youth are the advocates in the courtroom, they're the jurors, and they're also like the defense. And it's a program that would allow them to not only come up with a divertible solution, alternative model, but it allows those youth to see themselves in a way that they haven't. And that's something that I have experience in, working over 10 years in the Florence Law Academy. So it wasn't an experience where I just went into a classroom and maybe talked to people, but this is a 10-year relationship where I've worked with youth to help them build career pathways out of poverty to professional careers. And the youth court is something to do that. Lastly, I'll just quickly say, I would also support programs like Advanced Peace, have a mental health court at juvenile hall. We don't have a way to deal with individuals, especially in COVID, where they've had a lot of mental health crisis. And I've also been the founder of the Summer Institute of Energy Law and Policy, again, creating pathways for at-risk youth, not only to have something to do or hear a speaker, but actually build career pathways out of poverty.
All righty, thank you very much. And Thien, we're going to get to you for your answer on our last preset question. If elected, how do you plan to support prevention services for justice-impacted youth, aside from what's already being done to keep them in the same cycles of criminalization?
So 1/3 of children who are in the foster care system, when they time out of the system, they become homeless. So we have children that are in the dependency and delinquency system that when they time out, they become homeless. They get cycled again and again in the criminal justice system and in homelessness. So one of the proposals that I have is this. I have reached out to the trade unions and the trade unions, because what we should be doing is having job training when they're still in the dependency, delinquency in the system, when they're still working there. So they have job training, they have job placement, and they have a future when they time out. Nobody else is doing this, but we need to be doing that. Additionally, if you look at it in the last probably year or so, since 2020, there's been funding. $800,000 was funded for different grant programs for mental health in our community. There have been beds that have been opened up in regards to Turning Point and different other organizations, but all of them were for adults. What we need to do is have mental health programs for our juveniles. That is extremely important to make sure that we have that. And additionally, we need to have the intervention in the school system where we're talking about toxicity and intergenerational trauma and work with community-based organizations. We do that. And one of the things that our district attorney's office, and when we talk about transparency, these things are listed on the website at the Sacramento DA's office, is we have, for example, a youth academy that we've had for several years now. And that youth academy, we're teaching kids how to learn about the criminal justice system. And we bring in defense attorneys, we bring in judges, we bring in criminalists, we bring in community members to talk about these issues. So we have many of these programs already, and they're on our website. We have alternative courses as well, 13 of them to be specific. So we will continue to engage and divert and help, while also maintaining accountability and public safety as well. Thank you.
All righty, thank you very much. All right. Our audience has been very busy coming up with questions, and so we're going to get started for that. We are going to remind everybody and our candidates that they're 2 minutes worth of response to these questions as well. Our first audience question is this. Candidates, can you please specifically describe your work with youth in the past and provide examples about how this work helped divert youth from the criminal justice system? And Thien, because you answered last, we will start with you on this one.
So the entirety of my legal career.
I'm so sorry, Alana, that was supposed to be Thien starting this one.
I'm sorry.
You answered last on the last one. No problem. No problem. We'd like to be as fair as possible. We'll get to you in just a second. We see you're eager. Go ahead, Thien.
Yes, thank you. So in regards to working with youth in the community, I've been a mentor for youth, both at the Luther Burbank and with, in regards to programs such as Contract for Success, where we're intervening kids and making sure that they have a hope and a future. And in fact, I've worked over at the Luther Burbank Youth Academy, and specifically there in that particular area, it is a community of color. It's a marginalized community where you have a lot of immigrants and refugees. And in terms of trying to educate them about our criminal justice system, provide them a path forward. I've also, in my job as a prosecutor, worked with resentenced juveniles and diverting them away from prison on multiple cases, and really trying to work with them and make sure that we have a path forward for them, while we are also recognizing and acknowledging accountability and victims' rights as well.
All righty. And now, Alana.
I apologize. Thank you.
No problem. You need me to read
problem.
the question again?
No, I don't need you to read the question because I've spent almost my entire career in life doing this type of work.
Okay.
And one of the things that informs my work is that you can't have a check the box approach. I've actually was the president of Wiley Manual Bar Association when we started the Contract for Success program. And it's a program where we go into the classrooms and we talk to students about what they can do in their future, and they have a contract for success and they sign it. What we need to do to divert young people out of the criminal justice system to make sure they don't go and to disrupt that cycle is more than going into the classroom and having a check the box approach. And you need to start by listening to young people. There is trauma that they're experiencing. There's ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, and we have to be responsive to that. And then also we have to understand that we can't limit our youth. We can't say, oh, because if you had this situation, maybe we can put you in a vocational program. We have to see the potential. That's why I started in South Sacramento as the chair of the Florida Law Academy. And I've recently worked at Valley High School with the Healthcare Careers Academy so that these young people can begin to see, just like I had to see in myself, my way out was to get good grades, go to college, become a lawyer, become a doctor, become an engineer. So we have to grab on the potential if we really want to see a difference that they are making. Additionally, I served as board chair on the Girl Scouts, and we had a unit in juvenile hall, a Girl Scout troop, because you also sometimes have to let these children, be youth, have a chance to do arts and crafts or explore nature. In the Florida Law Academy, we've taken them to Yosemite. So it's a much more comprehensive approach that we have to be responsive not only to the trauma that they have experienced, but the unlimited future that they can achieve.
All righty, thank you so much. I don't know that I've ever hosted or moderated a forum where the candidates have stuck so closely to the time. I just want to say appreciate that, because that's going to get in more questions from the audience. And we are going to move on to our next question. Alana, we're going to start with you on this one. Okay. This question comes from the Adult Industry Laborers and Artists Association. Recent reports from Government Accountability Office and USC Gould show that over policing sex trafficking and sex work paradoxically harms marginalized sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. This especially harms immigrant, LGBTQ, and BIOPC sex workers and survivors of sex trafficking who find themselves incarcerated. Will the candidates commit to ending prosecution of prostitution and related crimes, including prosecution of buyers and pimps, all of which are often used to harass, arrest, and charge sex workers and sex trafficking survivors with crimes?
So I think that's a great point that's being brought up, and it's an issue that has been overlooked. When we look at sex crimes, there's a whole myriad of issues. Some people choose that because maybe they don't feel like they have an ability to do anything else, and others are forced to do it because they are trapped or they're being trafficked. So either way, it seems that they're both sets of victims, and we should not have any efforts to further criminalize people who are already victimized. We should have trust. We should have rehabilitation. We should have healing from the trauma that has led them to either decision that they've made regarding that. So I think it's important that we make sure we're not causing any harm. We don't have any policies or practices that is increasing the harm in individuals' lives, but we have policies that hold people accountable who are actually causing harm in the community. And we have healing and recovery for those who have suffered from it.
All righty. And then Thien, moving on to you for this question. It was a long one. Do you need me to read it again?
Sure.
Okay. This question comes from the Adult Industry Laborers and Artists Association. Recent reports from the Government Accountability Office and USC Gould show that over-policing sex trafficking and sex work paradoxically harms marginalized sex workers and sex trafficking survivors. This especially harms immigrant, LGBTQ, and BIPOC sex workers and survivors of sex trafficking who find themselves incarcerated. Will the candidate commit to ending prosecution of prostitution and related crimes, including prosecution of buyers and pimps, all of which are often used to harass, arrest, and charge sex workers and sex trafficking survivors with crimes?
You know, in answering this question, I don't want to just use buzzwords such as trust and rehabilitation and healing. I want to go deeper than that, because I've actually prosecuted human traffickers. I've prosecuted those exploiters who have preyed upon children and minors and put them out on the streets to exploit them in the sex industry. I've actually done that. And so I have the experience, and I've actually talked with, interviewed, and worked with people in the area of human trafficking prevention and prosecution. For example, I work with 3 Strands. It's an organization that that goes out there and does prevention and education, not only in the schools, but work with victims of human trafficking so that we take them away from that life. There are those that choose to be engaged in the human trafficking business, but there are many, especially children, that are forced into this. And if we don't prosecute the exploiters, and if we make it completely legal, we are letting the exploiters exploit the most vulnerable among us, the children. So we need to focus on intervening. We have Reset Court, which is in juvenile hall, so that when we contact and intervene with a child that has been being exploited, that they get a path, they meet counselors, they get wraparound services, they get job placement, and they get housing as well. So I'm not just going to use slogans and buzzwords. I've actually engaged in the process of trying to end the exploitation of children and minors. And we need to keep that in mind for those that don't want to do it, and those that are forced to do it, and those that need to be saved from doing it.
All right, thank you so much. And Thien, because asked on that question, we're going to start with you on another audience question that we're ready for now. There is a disproportionate number of young men and boys of color who are victims of violent crimes, as well as a disproportionate arrest rate for this group. What would you do to support young men and boys of color to keep them safe and treat them fairly within the criminal justice system?
You know, one of the things that we're talking about is the statistics are there. There are inequities within our system of justice based upon the inequities that we have in society as a whole. And I want to talk about a program right now that is really addressing this issue of intergenerational toxicity. It's the Wellness Foundation that Gina Warren is running out of North Sacramento in Del Paso Heights. What they do is they take young men and boys of color, and they create a healing circle. And they're talking about and getting to the root cause of what is causing the criminality, what is causing this behavior. And so they immediately intercept and try to stop it. And I think what we need to do, there's always a level, and I've talked about this with Gina Warren, I've talked about this with Mervyn Brookins, is you have to have accountability first, but then you can have rehabilitation and redemption. So one of the things that happens in a criminal justice system is when a case gets prosecuted, all right, at the very end, when somebody is finished doing their time in county jail, they get released, and the probation department comes in and does a need risk assessment at the end. But what we need to do is move that need risk assessment on certain cases to the front end, so that if there is a drug abuse issue, if there is a mental health issue, you then get behavioral health in on the front end of it to follow the individual through so that we can stop and figure out what is happening there. But we also always have to make sure that we have accountability, we have public safety, and that we consult and talk with victims of violence in these cases. But there are things that we can do, that we are doing, that we will do, that will interject and stop this from happening.
All righty, thank you. And time now for Alana, you to answer the same question. Would you like me to read it again?
No, you don't have to read it again. You know, there may be the perception that there's so much that's being done, but there's so much more that needs to be done. The reality is we have these disparities, and it should not be up to Gina Warren to try to figure out how do we address that. As the DA of Sacramento County, anyone who is in leadership in that office ought to be addressing that. A recent study came out that showed that the Sacramento Police Department had disproportionately stopped Black and brown individuals in our community, which then goes and informs that the cases that are being referred. So that needle, we shouldn't be reacting to crime. We have to be preventive and intervening. And it's not only the right thing to do, it's the law. We had a new bill that went into effect, the California Racial Justice Act, that requires that the DAs look at disparities in charging, in sentencing, anywhere where implicit bias, racial bias has entered into a criminal justice proceeding. We have the responsibility to make sure we are weeding that out. And so it takes data. I think that as the next DA, I would have transparency so everyone in the community can see who are we charging and what are the charges. And then you analyze that data. You see if you're having any trends. You know, I teach implicit bias in the law at McGeorge, and I always say bias is the water. It's not the shark. It's how you respond to that bias. And if you ignore that bias, if you put it on community service providers, then you're not solving the problem. So as DAs, we have to have the responsibility to take the leadership to look at the disparate impact facts, and we have to look ourselves and say, is there a need for treatment or mental health services? How can we right the wrong? Because that's the moment that we're in now, and that's the change people in Sacramento County have been asking for, and that I am prepared to lead on.
All righty, thank you so much. We touched on this a little bit in one of our preset questions, but our third question from all of our viewers is going to go to you, Alana, first, and it is 63% of people in California jails are being held pre-trial. What steps would you take to reduce the rate of pre-trial incarceration?
Well, as I mentioned before, I think the pretrial services program is very good because they're able to do an in-depth analysis. I was just recently listening to a county board of supervisors meeting where I believe the court has actually contracted for the public defender's office to actually supplement some of the work that the probation's pretrial services program is going to do. So I'm a very solutions-oriented person. When we open up our criminal justice system and we want to be responsive, we have to create solutions that are going to address the problem. And we wouldn't have those high numbers if it was already being done. And I think it's great to have the ideas when the light bulb has gone on, but we also have to look at what's the demonstrated record. When I was at the public advisor's office, I opened up our public policy proceedings to bring more voices to the table. I created an equity initiative that specifically addressed the disparities in our energy policy and programs. And I'm going to bring that same skill set to our criminal justice system to look at what are the disparities we're seeing, whether it's in pretrial detentions or it's in our charging practices, and make sure that we address that. And there's a way to address it while still holding people accountable, but we're holding them accountable because of the crime they committed, not the color of their skin.
All righty, and Thien, we're going to move on to you. This third question from 63% of people in California jails are being held pre-trial. What steps would you take to reduce the rate of pre-trial incarceration?
I think those things are already being done. When we're talking about 63%, we're talking about statewide. But I know in Sacramento, we engage in those pre-trial services. We engage in the process of looking at a case. And in fact, when a person is brought to court the first time under case law, under precedent, and under the law, what we do is we look at the individual and whether they pose a threat to public safety, whether they have the ability to make bail based upon their economic resources. So when we're talking about this, we're doing a lot of these things already. And so when we hear criticism, sometimes those criticisms are from those that are not prosecutors, haven't prosecuted for many, many years. And I have been in the system and worked in the system for the last 2 decades, understanding these really detailed policy-oriented issues. And that's what we're looking at. And we're working with the public defenders. We're working with probation. We're working with the court to try to come up with these solutions to deal with these issues and have a system that is equitable while at the same time balancing public safety.
All righty, thank you so much. And Alana, now for you to answer this question. And what, I'm sorry, we're moving on to the next question, pardon me. So Thien, we're going to start back with you. What ways will you restore community district attorney's ability to ensure public safety for communities of color when confronted with police brutality and excessive use of force, such as was the case of Stefan Clark's shooting death?
First of all, there are 2 things that I want to address. Number one is if a police officer, if an individual, whether they wear a uniform or whether they wear blue jeans, whether they're on parole or whether they're a police officer, if you violate the law, you will be held accountable. And as prosecutor, what we do is we follow the facts and the law, and we hold people accountable regardless of what they do, whether they're a doctor, a lawyer, whether they pick up garbage, whether they work in a restaurant, whether they're a police officer, it doesn't matter. The obligation of a prosecutor is to follow the facts and the law and to hold those who violate the law accountable. And one of the things that we should do and need to do, and I would start, is an advisory committee made up of people from different and diverse communities to come in and advise and have that conversation with the district attorney's office, with law enforcement, to do those very things and become that relationship and develop that relationship. And that relationship sometimes does not exist and oftentimes has not existed between law enforcement and between communities. And that needs to change, and we're going to change it. And that is a reality of it that we have to recognize and move forward on.
All righty, thank you for your answer. And Alana, same question. Do you need me to read the question again?
Yes, please.
Okay. In what ways will you restore community trust in the district attorney's ability to ensure public safety communities of color when confronted with police brutality and excessive use of force, such as was the case in the Stefan Clark shooting death?
Yeah, I think that we just need to take a pause, because you can't put up a fence, you can't cut off communication and think that you're building trust and you're moving forward with deepening relationships with the community. We actually have to go into the communities. And that's something that I've been doing. And that's why I'm running for DA, because that's how you build trust. It's not about you understanding who we are as the prosecutors, it's understanding who the community is and understanding. And it's great to have an advisory committee. I've actually proposed that on my platform as well. But it's nothing that replaces the experience of going into the community and understanding how they experience safety, how they experience justice, and how they experience fairness. I agree that it doesn't matter the position you hold, the money you make, or the uniform that you wear. But what we have seen in Sacramento County in these communities of color is that there has not been accountability. Even though this question talks about Stefan Clark, but we look at the Joseph Mann case, where even the Sacramento Police Department said those officers had crossed the line. But in the DA's office, the executive decision that was made, or all the leaders, the decision was made, was not to pursue justice in that instance. There was no accountability. They found that just the actions were justified. And these are difficult conversations. You know, I teach implicit bias in the law. I've led racial discussions, but you have to have a leader who is courageous enough, who's going to have those conversations with the community and listen, and not just co-sign. So if we're going to be real about this, if we're going to bring real change, we have to be honest about where we have been in the DA's office currently and where we need to go. And that needs to be informed by the community and included with the community.
All right, thank you so much for that. And our next question from all of our viewers who've signed on today, Alana, we're going to start with you. What is your position regarding charging minors as adults? Show that this has been a large gap in the Sacramento DA office that leads many community members to hesitate in maintaining trust in the DA's office. How will you address this gap?
So this is one of the issues that I feel that youth should be charged as youth, because the value of placing a 16 or 17-year-old in prison with 40, 50-year-old men, I just don't see the value. As I said earlier, youth are malleable. They have the greatest propensity to rehabilitate. And I think it's better to put the energy in those prevention and intervention services. Now, of course, when this comes up, we always have like the most egregious youth that has committed horrific murders. And I just believe that that's indicative of the lack of services of how we failed them in their life beforehand. So I would like to lead the office in directing resources to have those prevention and intervention services so that we can disrupt crime. We know what the 4 drivers of crime are. We know who has the propensity. The research and data is there. We just have to focus our policy. But when we're stuck in a cycle of just reacting to crime and we don't want to invest time and resources into prevention and intervention strategies, then we're going to still be in this loop.
All right. And your answer to the same question, would you like me to read it again?
No, I have it. Thank you.
Okay.
So first of all, I want to correct some misinformation. We don't put 16 and 17-year-olds in prison cells with 40-year-olds. That doesn't happen. When juveniles are sentenced to prison or to DJJ, to juvenile, to CYA, as it was called before, they're actually placed with those that are of the same age. So that simply doesn't happen. So I want to correct that misinformation. What I want to say about is this: when we have blanket policies of never prosecuting a juvenile as an adult, we're always prosecuting a juvenile as an adult. Blanket policies like that are dangerous. And in fact, they are an abdication of the discretion of the district attorney's office. If you're going to be a district attorney and the district attorney of Sacramento, it is imperative that you use your discretion and your expertise and not just make blanket policies. And here's why it's important. There are times when we have juveniles who have committed, as my opponent said, some of the most heinous crimes. What will you do when you have a juvenile that walks into a school and kills 10 kids? What will you do when you have a juvenile that walks into a church and kills 10 people based upon the color of their skin? Are you automatically going to fall back upon this general policy and not use your discretion and your expertise? As somebody who's prosecuted the most heinous cases, as somebody who has the experience and the expertise in the courtroom and that is currently a prosecutor, we look at each and every case. And let me tell our audience this. The decision to prosecute a juvenile as adult is one of the most serious decisions, but it's not up to us, because what happens is we file that decision, that request, and a judge, a judicial judge, an arbiter looks at the case, talks to the expert witnesses, listens to the defense, takes the witnesses, and they make the decision. That's what we do. And in the vast majority of cases where that has been done in Sacramento County, the judge has upheld the decision to do so by the district attorney. But to make blanket policies is an abdication of our discretion and our responsibility.
That is
to
your
victims.
time. That is your time. And we're going to start with our next question with you. A lot of people in our audience, as you can tell, candidates, very concerned about the young people in our community. So we're kind of getting at these issues from all sides. And the way this one was phrased, how will you contribute to ending the school to prison pipeline? Thien?
What that really involves is education. What that really involves is getting into the schools with mental health programs, especially for kids in marginalized communities. What is happening in our communities right now, and has been happening for many, many years, is that there's intergenerational trauma, there's toxicity, there is crime, and what it does is it has an effect where it causes these juveniles to engage in criminal activity, and we need to intervene in it, we need to help them. And when we have programs and we work with the probation department and we work with juvenile and we work with community-based organizations, we have a real opportunity to go ahead and turn that around. And you always balance that out with accountability and with making sure that we ensure public safety, but there's a lot that we can do, that we have done and we will do to address those things. And we've talked about it, both Ms. Mathews and myself today as well, but there's a lot to do and we need to do it.
All right, and turning now to Alana, we're going to ask you the same question, or do you need me to repeat it?
Yes, please repeat it.
Okay. How will you contribute to ending the school to prison pipeline?
I will contribute to ending the school to prison pipeline by coming out of the courtroom and getting into the community, coming out of the office, because the reason why you have that pipeline, I mean, it's great to say we'll go into the schools, but a lot of the children who are being placed in the juvenile justice system, they aren't going to school. That's not a program that they're going to be accessible for. So we have to look at what are the root causes. It's been disinvestment in the community. It's been lack of opportunity. I spend a lot of time in Del Paso Heights, and that's what a lot of parents are saying. There's simply nothing for the children to do. During the time of pandemic, there's now been exasperation of mental health issues. We're trying to go to, Zoom classes. And so when you're disconnected, you don't see what the real issue is and the root causes. And that's what we have to address. When you talk about adverse childhood experiences and trauma, you can't bring someone to a program or even bring them to mental health services until you address that trauma, until you have trust with trusted individuals, incredible messengers. So we have to start having investments. That means the DA has to be at the table with housing and economic development and businesses, programs like the Girl Scouts or other community-based arts, cultural, musical programs, so that we have something for children to do, so that we interrupt the school to prison to pipeline. And we need to start at elementary schools, and we need to meet all of their needs, not just pick and choose. So there are elementary school students who are being tracked. I mean, it's based on third grade reading levels. We need to supplement. I think it's a great opportunity for prosecutors to get into the community to experience and see how people actually experience safety and justice with volunteer work. I think that opens our eyes to what the real issues are. So we know we just can't have the check the box program by saying, oh, we should do this or we should do this. We actually have to meet people where they are and address those root causes.
All righty, and that was your time exactly for that question. Moving on to another question from our very smart and involved audience. We appreciate all of you viewers who are sending these in. Do you support sending young offenders to restorative justice programs and other avenues that divert young people from the juvenile system? If so, what would you do as district attorney to promote these programs?
That's for me, right? To start.
Yes. Mhm.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things that I mentioned is that I have a restorative justice program. I use the model of impact justice. They have a couple of programs in California and across the country. And what's so important about that is, again, it is having a youth take responsibility for the harm that they cause, but then it goes to the next step and says, how can you repair that harm? And then how can you commit to not having the harm in the future? So having a restorative justice program, you have to work with professionals who understand how to do this. There's a lot of work that goes into preparing both the person who has been harmed and the person who has harmed. But what's most important about the restorative justice program is that it centers the voices of survivors, the people who have been harmed. If you just think about the time maybe you've harmed somebody, it's hard to take account of that, to face them and say, okay, what do I need to do to make it right? So you're centering the voices of survivors, and you're also holding a youth to a higher standard that's going to be more impactful in changing and transforming their life.
All righty. 10 question to you. Would you like me to read it again?
No, I got it. Thank you, though.
Okay.
You know, I think my opponent and I both agree. You know, I have proposed, as part of my platform, a restorative neighborhood court. And we should extend that, and we should have that with juveniles. We have the ability to intervene and to change lives, and we should be able to do so while balancing public safety and always making sure that we include victims in that process. A lot of times, victims are ignored, they're silenced, but we need to make sure that that doesn't happen, that they're included. And I know that in the district attorney's office in Sacramento County, we always make sure that what we do is victim-centered. We have victim advocates in the office. We have those that are social workers that work and provide services to victims and include them in the process so that they're informed. They know what's going on. And we work in the community. We have community prosecutors. We're embedded. We are in the community, work with community-based organizations. So when there's criticism of the DA's office, I think those criticisms are sometimes based upon a lack of awareness of what it is that we're doing, the things that we've talked about and that we promote and that we have on our website. We have an app that goes out and talks about intervention with kids and provide them with resources. And so being an attorney and a prosecutor in the office now and being aware of those services, I want to make sure that people are aware of them, because we do that, we have done that, and we're going to expand even more on that.
All righty. And then Tanya will take this next question first. Proposition 47, a ballot measure passed by California in 2014, made some nonviolent property crimes misdemeanors. It also turned some simple drug possession offenses into misdemeanors. It also provides that past convictions for these charges may be reduced to a misdemeanor by a court. What are your thoughts about Prop 47?
I believe that coming from a country and having personally experienced injustice in a system of justice where we had no voice as citizens, the beautiful thing about this country is we actually have the ability to make our system of justice better. And I always believe that we should strive to do so. But in the process of doing so, we need to make sure that it's reasonable. And there are certain things that I would like to see happen. Number one, I would like to see that domestic violence, for example, be categorized as a violent offense. It's not under the law. Also, additionally, we want to make sure that we want to target those individuals that are engaging in theft rings, organized theft rings. They're committing offenses over and over again. You see them in the smash and grabs. You see them in those situations. There has to be a level of accountability where if you're not stealing for food, if you're not stealing for your necessity, but you're committing thefts over and over again, there has to be a level of accountability. And you have situations where you have small business owners, and I saw one in Oakland recently that had their entire inventory wiped out. This was a family business that was wiped out. So we need to have accountability when it comes to theft offenses, when it comes to those sort of cases. But we also need to expand a mental health and drug treatment program. We absolutely have to do that, because a lot of those issues are the underlying issues that cause and reverberate and cause other crimes. So we need to balance that as well.
All righty. Candidate Mathews, your thoughts about Prop 47?
I think Prop 47 was a very strong step in the right direction to repair a lot of the harm that has been disproportionately impacted on communities of color. What I will say is that it's been the topic and use for a lot of, and blame for a lot of things that are going on. It is unacceptable to have these smash and grabs that we are seeing on television, and certainly people need to be held accountable. But what's happening is we're not looking at it the whole way. So what I want to be as a DA is have a crime strategies unit. So we're being more strategic, because what's happening is the people of color, the low level, they're being paid money to go and do these smash and grabs. But what happens with all that inventory? It gets sold. That's why you have organized retail theft. And we are not being strategic in analyzing the data and going after the individuals who are actually taking that merchandise and selling it, whether they're selling it online or they're selling it at a denials or a flea market. And so I'm happy to see that there's legislation right now that is being responsive to that crime and to that instances of how that is happening. So we're not going to spend time looking back and blaming policies of the past, but we're going to be moving forward. And we're actually going to hold those accountable who stand to benefit the most. When you're talking about millions of dollars, hundreds of items of merchandise, it's not the person who's looking for $50 or $100 to go get it, who's the organizing all of this together. So we have to be more strategic in how we go about that. But certainly we need to hold anybody who is committing offenses accountable, but we need to do it in a way that's not causing harms or perpetuating disparate or racial injustices in our community.
All righty. And obviously stay with us, because you're going to be answering this next question first. Sacramento County Schools currently have the highest suspension and expulsion rates for Black students for the 4th year in a row for any county in the state. What would you do as DA to hold school districts accountable to changing practices within schools to disrupt the school to prison pipeline system? So drilling down on this issue of the school to prison pipeline again.
I would acknowledge the problem. So many times we're just turning a blind eye and we're just having this check the box moment. So we need to have a partnership with school districts. I think that there's a multifaceted approach that we can have. So we have resources for students who are in the school, but we need to have the data. Data-driven solutions, I believe, are always the best. And so we need to track. When we have individuals that come into the juvenile justice system, we need to look at the disparities. What are we charging them with? The data is there. If we are only suspending African-American students, that shows us that the data is there. I think we should have mentorship programs. I think we should have mental health resources. We have to prioritize where the problem is. And so if this is where we're seeing it's glaring out at us that this is an issue that needs to be addressed, the DA should be a leader in the resources, because in the end, that's going to create a more safe, fair, and just community for everybody.
All righty. And we're going to ask you the same question. Would you like me to read it again?
I got it. Thank you.
Wonderful.
First of all, the disparity is there, and it's real when it comes to school suspensions. And we really have to look at it and try to correct and make sure that it's fair and equitable to everybody. But I want to draw a distinction here. It's an important distinction that people may not understand. This race is for the district attorney's office. It's not for the city council. It's not for the school board. It's not for the mayor. It's not for the Senate or the assembly. It's for the district attorney's office. And the district attorney's office has a very specific responsibility and duty under the Constitution. And that is to protect public safety when it comes to the prosecution of cases and using the discretion. Now, there's wide latitude that we have in terms of implementing different policies when it comes to a crime that has been committed. But that's when we entered into the system. A crime has been committed, and then we look at it and we deal with it. We could deal with it in the juvenile system, or we can deal with it in the adult system. But there are things that are beyond the scope of the DA's office. Now, where can we stand up and speak out and have a voice in it? And I've always advocated that. And I've always advocated that you stand up and you speak out and you ask for certain things and have a seat at the table. But those decisions about resources and those decisions about whether to suspend somebody or don't suspend somebody, that's at the school board. And so a lot of these procedures and ideas are great, and I support them and I agree with them. But we need to make the distinction. This is a position for the district attorney. And when you look at that, it's a certain level of experience and expertise and work in that area. And there's another area where we can make changes in the city council and the board of supervisor, but this is for the district attorney's office. And it allows us to have a platform to advocate for certain things. But there are things that are the responsibility and the purview under the Constitution and our division of government that must be respected.
All righty. We have a very eager and insightful audience, and they are filling up my chat here with lots of questions. So I just want to make sure that both of you are okay to keep going a little bit longer. Yes? All righty. Okay, so that question second. So we will start with you. In the next one, we're going back to our topic of immigration. For those cases that have resulted in immigration damaging convictions due to legal and constitutional errors for non-citizen defendants, what will you do to ensure that the DA's office implements a cooperative and accessible post-conviction relief process for the immigrant community?
We have such a process, and we review those cases on a regular basis. In fact, I review many of those cases. You'll have, for example, a case where an individual went before the court, and unfortunately, they were not made aware of the immigration consequences. It could be 15 years ago, 20 years ago, before the changes in the law, and their attorney may not have informed them of those consequences and deprived them of the right to due process. And so those cases, when they come up, what we do is we go through a review process, a vetting process. We pull the transcript that's available. We look at it. We look at the cases. We work with the defense attorneys. And oftentimes we work with the judge in order to make sure that there is due process, there is equity in those cases. And we don't go out there and brag about it and advertise it, but those are things that we do. And we do it on a regular basis, on a continuing basis that we have done and will continue to do. And I know that it's easy sometimes to criticize the DA's office, especially when you're not a DA, and to cast aspersions on things that we haven't done. But we do a lot of these things already and will continue to do it.
All right, thank you so much. And then Alana, you need me to read the question again?
No.
Okay, all righty.
So what I would do is form a partnership with an organization called For the People. They've really been leaders in this sort of work. And one of their board members is actually Rose Khan, who is an expert in immigration and resentencing and post-conviction relief. So I think it's important that we have a policy and we actually have a unit that is devoted to not just waiting until these cases come up, but let's be proactive and look at those cases, because I don't think justice is just a responsibility that we engage in when we're reacting to a situation, that we can be proactive. And that sort of goes into the last question that was asked. Certainly understanding what is the responsibility of the district attorney's office. But when we are talking about having safety for the entire community, you have to realize that sometimes you have to have relationships with other people, because that directly impacts safety. Education and safety can go together, just like mental health and safety can go together. Homelessness and safety can go together. And so part of the reason why our system is not working for everyone is because we've limited that role just to being in the courtroom, when we need to be in the community and we need to make those connections. So I would be happy to work with For the People, the immigration. I believe that the Public Defender's Office is actually looking to hire an expertise. And so I'd love to have a partnership, because we should be seeking justice at every opportunity that we have to do so.
All right, and this will touch on some of the same sorts of issues, but we want people to know we're asking their questions in the way that they sent them into us. So Alana, for you, Sacramento is experiencing increased rates of refugee resettlement in the region, with many coming from countries with deep trauma, and that leads to misconduct in domestic and academic life here in Sacramento. When engaged from a wellness first approach, that many of these offenders need assistance beyond just the criminal justice system. What will you do to ensure that all is done to understand the root cause of these offenses and ensure holistic justice is enacted?
I think one of the best ways and most effective approaches is to ensure that we have a workforce that is understanding of those unique issues. So there can always be room for improvement in the diversity hires in the Sacramento County DA's office. But I also think that I have proposed having an advisory committee of members of immigrant communities, the business communities, and other crime impacted communities. Because what I learned when I was public advisor at the California Energy Commission is that you have to have trust. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So we have to to have trusted advisors that understand what are the cultural nuances that or issues that we ought to be aware of and be respectful of. And we don't want to lead by issues. We want to lead by values. And my values are safety, fairness, and justice. So when we look at the refugee community, we want to meet them where they are and understand what safety means for them. What does justice and accountability look like for them? And having that informed approach, coupled with a trauma-informed approach, will help us be more responsive to those communities.
All righty. And 10, same question to you. Do you need me to read it again?
I got it. Thank you.
Mhm.
This question is very personal for me because as a refugee and a political refugee who came to this country and experienced the shock of a new culture, having to learn a new language, learning a new culture, going to school and feeling absolutely alone, and being immersed in a system of justice. I've been a victim of a crime. I've been a victim of a drive-by shooting, an attempted home invasion robbery. I've been in those situations where my family has been afraid to speak to the police, where I've had to translate for them when I did learn how to speak English. And so when you ask this question, it's very personal for me. And one of the things that is important is for communities such as the immigrant community is to see people on the other side, on law enforcement, in government, that look like them, that understand their experiences and their culture. And I understand the experiences of a refugee and an immigrant and all that that carries. And I'm not just talking about slogans and buzzwords and general ideas. We have had programs and policies and values that addresses that. For example, when we discovered that immigrants were being unduly preyed upon by property owners in different apartment complexes, we created a program called Know Your Rights. We partnered with different community organizations to educate immigrants and refugees on those things. So those are things that we have done, continue to do to build trust in those communities. And that is a community that I come from and that I understand.
All righty, this is our last question, believe it or not, and 10 will start with you. In other counties such as Alameda and Contra Costa, the DA has been available to host monthly roundtable discussions with community members and grassroots organizations. In these monthly meetings, community members can discuss policies and practices of the office and identify problems and solutions to prevent harm and increase community safety. If elected, would you be willing to participate in a monthly community engaging roundtable discussion with SAC for the People's Coalition and community members?
First of all, I was the first person when I decided to run for district attorney, and I had put it on my platform and talked about it, was to have such an advisory committee and these conversations with different communities. I'll commit to it 100%, absolutely, to do so. I think we need to have conversations and develop relationships. And, you know, working in the community for the last 18 years and being involved and talking to people in the community, I am absolutely engaged and want to talk and have talked and have worked with people in the community. And I think it's important to develop those relationships because when you have those relationships, which I have, you develop trust. And when you develop trust, you have relationships, which I have with many different communities throughout Sacramento County. Then what you have is you have a beautiful system of justice where we can serve each other and lift each other up. I'm oftentimes reminded of a saying, a rising tide lifts all ships. And that's what we need to do, is lift each other up and continue to do so. And I'm committed to that. Thank you.
All righty. And then your answer to our last question, Alana.
Can you read it again, please?
I most definitely can. In other counties such as Alameda and Contra Costa, the DA has been available to host monthly roundtable discussions with community members and organizations. In these monthly meetings, community members can discuss policies and practices of the office and identify problems and solutions to prevent harm and increase community safety. If elected, would you be willing to participate in a monthly community engaging roundtable discussion with SAC for the People Coalition and community members?
Absolutely. And I would say that I don't have to wait until I'm elected. I'm already engaged in those conversations. I started my campaign by talking to the most crime impacted communities and the organizations that serve them, not among the donors, not among the political elites or special interest groups. And so I think that is vital. That has informed my approach and my platform in this campaign, and it will inform how we can administer justice in a more open open, transparent, and inclusive way. So absolutely, I will continue to have those conversations with you. I think it's very valuable. And I think it's important not only just for the DA to engage in those conversations, but to make sure your leadership is a part of that conversation, to make sure your deputy prosecutors are a part of that conversation. So often we are just so divided and we're so siloed, and it's time for leadership that's actually going to bring this community together. We can't hear you.
That is our last question out of, I hit the button and it didn't change, but that's our last question after a very engaging discussion. Thank you to all of our attendees who sent in so many questions. Sorry, we weren't able to answer all of them, but we are to the point now in our program where it's time for our candidates to give us their closing statements, and they are going to have 3 minutes apiece. And Alana, you were the last person answering, so we will start this portion of the program with you.
It's time for change in Sacramento County, a change that will open our justice system to include more voices, more experiences, and more solutions for safety. The current policies and practices have failed to keep our community safe. We hear about it in the tragic headlines. We see it in the homeless crisis in our community, the epidemic of mental health and substance abuse problems, and the growing statistics of the disparate harm in poor and communities of color. The change we need is in a leader who not only has a compelling story of overcoming adversity and achieving success, but a demonstrated record of helping others overcome adversity to create their own stories of success. I am that leader. I worked in the diversion courts as a prosecutor, and I've worked as a mentor in the community to women who've been formerly incarcerated and battle substance abuse. That means I've taken the late night calls. I presented a 3-year sobriety chip, encouraged them to go back to school, reviewed a resume for a good job, and help them transition to a stable, successful future. The change we need is in a leader who won't just talk about how to tackle difficult problems with youth and immigrants. We need a leader who's already doing it. For more than 10 years, I've worked with the at-risk youth at the Florence Law Academy. I helped my mentee, Dominique, when I met her, she was just a junior, see a future beyond South Sacramento. And that's why last February, she was sworn in as an attorney for the California State Bar. And my second mentee, Deepak Kumar, well, he just graduated from Santa Clara Law School and he's studying for the bar now. I've also hosted free legal clinics covering a range of immigration topics to make legal resources and information more accessible to our community members who need it most. I am the leader who, after being appointed by Governor Brown as the public advisor for the California Energy Commission, opened up our public proceedings, built a statewide coalition, and coordinated a multi-agency advisory committee to ensure disadvantaged communities and voices were at the table. As your next DA, I will open up our criminal legal system to bring more voices to the table. I will establish advisory councils for our immigrant, business, and other crime-impacted communities. I am the leader who was appointed to serve as chief consultant for the California legislature, working with the governor, other state legislatures, to ensure there was adequate oversight for our climate policy programs and investments for all Californians. As your next DA, I will ensure that we have appropriate oversight and accountability to ensure a fair and just legal system that works for everyone. But most importantly, I am a survivor of violence. When I was a youth, and I was not seen as a victim in our broken system. So today I stand before you as a leader who is now committed to improving it. Thank you.
All righty, thank you. And that means we're moving on to 10 for your closing statements.
Thank you. As a prosecutor, the first time you sentence someone to prison or talk to a survivor of a violent crime such as rape or a family member of someone who was murdered, you realize the importance and the magnitude of the responsibility of being a prosecutor. Every time I've stood up in court for the last 20 years, the last 2 decades as a prosecutor, I've announced Tin Ho for the people, for the people. That has special significance because the district attorney is the attorney for the people, for you, and not just you, but everyone. If you're going to hire an attorney to represent you and your family, what would you look for? Would you want an attorney who is currently doing the job or someone who last did the job a decade ago? Would you want someone who has been a prosecutor for 20 years? Would you want someone that handled the most complex victim-sensitive cases over and over again, someone who has tried nearly 100 jury trials at every level of the case? Would you want someone that had the experience not only in the courtroom, but in the executive room, someone who actually trained, hired, and supervised prosecutors, who's managed the budget of a DA's office, the office of which they are seeking employment, the DA's office? Would you want someone that worked in the community to mentor, use, educate, and protect immigrants? Would you want someone that worked as a prosecutor in restorative justice programs with the community rather than just talking about it? Would you want someone with the experience of an immigrant, a refugee, and a victim of a crime? Would you want to hire someone that has the experience of withering pain of injustice? Would you want to hire someone that has the credibility with all the partners in the criminal justice system because they receive the endorsement from the union that represents both prosecutors and public defenders? Would you want to hire someone who has spent 2 decades protecting the public, victims of crimes, while also ensuring justice? I believe that after answering each of those questions, you will hire me as your district attorney. Thank you.
Again, both of you did excellent on time today. I can't tell you how different that is from many, many forums where people are constantly going over, but you've really given the voters who have been listening and watching to this today the time to get in as many of their concerns and hear clearly from each of you without anybody stepping over one another. So we appreciate you. Thank you so much for your time today. And thank you to the hundreds who have been watching and listening. We just have a few logistical things here at the end. We, in our closing announcements, want to let you know that we will be doing this again. We're hosting a second candidate debate forum from centering racial justice and restorative justice that is already scheduled for April 30th, and both candidates have been invited. We put the registration link in the chat here, so keep an eye out for our new flyer for that particular event. And please take a moment to fill out the voter pledge card. The link is being provided in the chat. If you're interested in receiving future emails from SAC for the People, you can indicate so on that form. Register in advance for our April DA candidate forum using the following link, also in the chat. And please don't forget to vote in this primary district attorney election. That election date is June 7th, 2022. You can do all the education you want to, but if you don't actually get to the polls or fill out your ballot and properly mail it in, all of this is for naught. Lastly, we want to invite you to Court Watch SAC, which is hosting a training tomorrow afternoon from 4 to 5 p.m. Court Watch is a platform for community to come together to observe the judicial process and gather information on court outcomes in an effort to identify patterns and practices that may contribute to systemic inequity. If you are interested in registering for the training, you can click the link that will be appearing in the chat. Again, thank you so much for taking time out of your become a better informed voter here in Sacramento County. My name is Sonseeahray Tonsall. I've been moderating this today. I work over at Fox 40, and educated voters are just something that really gets me excited. So it's nice to know that so many people in our area want to know about the issues that can impact them throughout their daily lives. It really doesn't matter to learn about it at the end, after the vote's taken, after the decision has been made in court. It matters on this side of it all. So thank you all and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.